All right, so last class we introduced ourselves to Plato and the idea of Platonic idealism, the belief that the objects of thought are the true reality. And we largely spent our time exploring various aspects of this and trying to simply acclimate ourselves to thinking about the world the way Plato did. By way of brief recap, Plato essentially argued that we live in a physical world around us, obviously, and we're barraged with a variety of different looking things. But our mind organizes and makes sense out of all these things by comparing the objects of sense experience to a small group of patterns, abstract patterns, or what he called forms, from which these things derive. And he's never particularly clear about how exactly this works. This is philosophy, it's not physics. But he's trying to make sense of how the human mind organizes its knowledge of the world, how we can understand that different looking people all belong to the class of human, and how we recognize that a variety of square-shaped things all share a quality in them called squareness. So it's the difference between looking at, say, the physical pyramids of Egypt and contemplating the concept of triangle from which it derives. And in this way, you can see that he's sort of following up on the pre-Socratic philosophers who had already divided the world into the realm of becoming, the physical realm of the five senses, where everything's always changing and becoming something else. And they had postulated that there must be some deeper, eternal, perfect substance of which the world is composed. So this division into what our senses see and what our mind is able to apprehend goes back to the beginning of philosophy. And Plato is elaborating on this and adding a lot more substance and detail and asking new kinds of questions, not just what the world is, but how our mind understands it as well. And you recall that we also have covered already a difficult question that all religions and philosophies have to deal with, the nature of evil. If people's acts of courage and justice and truth and beauty are all understood by way of deriving from these forms of these things, then what about when people do cowardly, nasty, unjust, lying sorts of actions, which we know human beings do? Plato did not believe that there were negative forms, anti-evil forms, pulling from the other direction. Ignorance. You either do the good or you're ignorant of the good. You either act in a way that's just and fair, or you act in a way that's selfish and self-interested, and you're simply acting in ignorance of the higher good that any thinking civilized person should accord their actions to. It's people's actions in ignorance of these high forms that creates the suffering for others that we call evil, but evil itself is not a real thing. Evil is simply the absence or the ignorance of the good. So, this gives us an optimistic idea about how we can make the world better. How do we make the world more good and just? What must we do with our citizens? If you educate the populace, if you basically make all of your citizens philosophers and get them all thinking in this way, that's how you make society better. And that was what brings us to the Allegory of the Cave. In a long discussion in his longest dialogue called The Republic, he's describing the utopian ideal society. And the question comes around to, well, how do we train citizens to properly contribute to an ideal utopian society? And that's when his most famous piece of writing, the Allegory of the Cave, comes. Before we get to that, I want to talk about just a couple of other little quick details to add to this. Plato had sort of mystical beliefs as well. He shared with Pythagoras the idea of reincarnation, of the transmigration of souls. And remember, it's very important to remember that the ancients did not know what your brain was for. They didn't think about your internal world as being the product of the mind. For them, they thought it was the product of your rational soul. The living force that animates you is different from what animates animals because you have a spark of the logos. You are able to understand the invisible structure behind things, and it is where rational thought comes from. Emotions emerge from the flesh, they believed. Like when you're angry and you just feel yourself shaking with anger. They thought that your body literally emanated emotions. But your soul was where rational thought came from. And this soul was thought to be immortal. And before you were born, Before your soul came down to animate your little body, guess where it was? Up here in the realm of the forms. There's a little spiritual you before you were born. Exactly, flying around, wee, having perfect knowledge of the forms. Until you were born, which causes your soul to be sucked down into a body, which gives it life and animates it. And Plato said that the process of being born, of your soul entering the body, also gave it amnesia. That's why babies are born not knowing anything. But going through life, the process of actually learning things is not learning new things that are completely alien to you. He likened learning as a process of recollecting. When you see roughly, crudely square-shaped things, it eventually triggers your memory of the perfect form of square, that concept that you once knew perfectly when you were a pure spiritual intellect before you were born. And that going through life is a process of recovering this lost knowledge. Have you ever had an experience in which you learned something new, maybe something in math or science, and once you learned it, it's like, wow, I can't believe I never really knew this. It seems so natural to understand this. Plato had that experience too, and that's what he literally thought was happening. You're simply recollecting lost knowledge, like an amnesiac. And if you get hit on the head and you get amnesia, is all your knowledge and memories gone completely? You show him familiar things. You show him, people of his family, familiar smells, items of his favorite hobby or whatever, and this causes and triggers the recollection of the lost knowledge. He thought that all learning was essentially like that, remembering what our intellectual souls knew perfectly before we were born. And that life is basically the fun little hide-and-seek adventure of recovering our knowledge. And that's also an optimistic way of looking at it, because that means that you potentially can know and understand everything. Differential equations is not beyond you. You once knew them perfectly. You just have to focus your mind on it, do the work of a good philosopher, think, study, question, and eventually you are going to remember all that hard math and all these philosophical concepts. They're all lurking potentially within you. We just got to educate people. We got to trigger them. And what is the methodology to trigger this recollection? That's what Socrates had shown. What Aristotle will later call dialectics, we originally called the Socratic method. And Plato believed that that's what Socrates was really up to. Remember, Socrates claimed that he had no knowledge of his own. He likened himself to the midwife of knowledge. A midwife is somebody that helps a woman give birth. And he thought that what he did with this constant peppering of people with questions and badgering them and forcing them to think and defend their opinions, he was basically prodding them into not being content with the superficial knowledge of this world, but triggering and forcing them to understand things on a higher, more general philosophical and abstract level. So this was not his wisdom he was teaching. He just thought he was prodding and triggering people into recovering this wisdom, which exists in its own realm above all of us. And that in this way only, was Socrates the wisest of mortals. He at least realized that his knowledge was meaningless and worthless. The only thing that is really worthwhile is this method and this desire, this passion for asking questions and thinking and making sure that our opinions are well-founded and defensible. And in the world's first democracy of Athens, this was an essential component, he believed, to contributing meaningfully and properly to your society. Every landowning citizen in Athens gets to vote and shape how their government is going to act. You get to vote and lend your opinion to what your government's going to do. And that's a responsibility that you have to take seriously. So Socrates wanted people to make sure that their decisions and opinions were based in reason and virtue. And from that method, Plato is inspired to realize that this is perhaps how we trigger our knowledge, and that this is what's really going on. Ultimately, it all culminates in something that's really hard to define in English, the logos. This universal, ordering, structuring, rational force that permeates the universe, structures and orders the universe, makes it sensible, and the little spark of this logos within all of us allows us to understand this invisible structure. Now, this idea that learning is really recollecting, Plato presented a very fascinating proof of this. In a dialogue called the Meno, Socrates and some other characters are sitting around talking about the nature of knowledge. And Socrates, as usual, he's sort of Plato's mouthpiece, is espousing ideas that are really Platonic idealism, that learning is really recollecting. And then he has Socrates prove it in this way. He calls in the slave that's been serving him wine all afternoon. He says, "Slave boy, come here." The slave boy, have you ever studied mathematics? "No, Socrates, I just serve the wine." "So you don't know anything about schooling or higher education?" No, I just serve the wine in the house." "Okay, then take a look at this problem." And he presents him with a square. And he basically gives him the same secret of the Master Masons question, the riddle that I gave you. How do you double the area of a square? Now, Zhao here has already figured out the hard way of doing it. If you have a square that's 1 by 1, its area is 1, you know that to double the area, you don't double the side because that would quadruple the area. You need the area to be 2, so the sides have to be the square root of 2. And where is the only place, if all you have is this inner square and you don't have a convenient radical symbol like this because it's not invented yet, where's the only place to find a length that corresponds to the square root of 2 in relation to the inner side unit? The diagonal. The Pythagorean theorem tells us that the diagonal of the inner square is going to be the square root of 2. So you simply take a rope, stretch that length, and use it for the length of the outer side. Okay, that was the hard way of doing it. There's an easier way that Socrates is going to show this slave. You're going to kick yourself when you see how easy this is. Behold, square. Take both diagonals. Now what does our square become? 4 triangles. Flip the triangles outwards like envelope flaps. Now how many triangles do you have? And how is 8 related to 4? It's double the area. Oh, the pain, I know. So that was the easy way to do it. Socrates basically leads the slave through these questions, and he explains, okay, you see that this would be the area. And essentially, when the slave is able to grasp upon the first showing and understand how this is double the area, because 8 is double 4, that's his evidence that all you got to do is just prod people and trigger in them a recollection, and they will figure out any concept in the world, because they already know it latently somewhere from our earlier time when our soul was with the forms. Let's go on to the Allegory of the Cave now. The Allegory of the Cave is one of the great classics of Western philosophical writings. Every humanities class at some point is going to teach you the Allegory of the Cave. You'll probably encounter this in some future class once again. But it was essential to understanding the process of how we rise above mere opinion and actually make sure that we have genuine knowledge. Now, I did not grade your work on the artistic skill. Stick figures were fine, okay? And yours might not look exactly like mine. You might have drawn from a different perspective or angle, okay? So I'm just going to draw my little sloppy version of this. These are the basic elements that you needed to include, okay? So there is, first of all, a cave. And along this cave is a wall to which are chained a bunch of prisoners. And they've been chained up their whole lives, and they know nothing but what they can see directly in front of them. Okay, here's my wall. And what they see in front of them are these murky shadows. Shadow of a tree. Shadow of a duck. We're going by in that direction. What they don't know is that behind them are people that they don't know are there who are carrying in their hands these statues. A statue of a tree. A statue of a duck. And they're walking by in this little corridor right behind our figures. And behind them is a raised way, and the main purpose of it is just so that physically and literally you can see that the fire up on this raised way is casting the shadows of the objects that are then seen on the wall by the prisoners. So the prisoners have no idea that this whole little puppet show is going on behind them. Now, one day, one of these prisoners is freed. And he looks behind him. There's his broken chains. He looks behind him and he sees for the first time ever the puppeteers that are creating the shadow marionette theater on the wall that he's always taken to be reality. His whole life he sat there with his friends, and because even at this dimmest level there's still the logos in you that wants to make sense and understand your world, they've spent their time playing the shadow game where they predict what shadow will come up on the wall next. That's all they have to do. They call that one grunt. They call that one gork. And they know that if 3 grunts come by, 2 gorks always come later. And this is knowledge for them. Grunt, 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 gork, gork. That's all they know. This guy is now freed and realizes that everything he'd taken to be reality is just the effect of these people behind the scenes. And when he realizes this, he exclaims the only thing he can think to say, "Holy crap. I had no idea that my reality was really just the effect of somebody else's manipulations." And as he continues to look along here, he then notices that there is an exit to the cave. There's a mouth of the cave. A little dim light coming in, enough to encourage him. Now, it's a steep and rough ascent crawling out of the cave. And so he's got to climb. It's not easy. But then finally, he's able to step outside the cave, out into the real world. And when he gets out into the real world, what does he see? An actual tree. By a lake. With a duck. He says, quack. And he realizes again, oh my God, what I thought was this higher, proper, true reality was also just a facsimile of a yet even higher reality. And once again, he is now outside. Ooh. And the real things that he sees outside the cave are far more interesting and beautiful than that dim image he had seen before. And finally, after much effort, because after living in darkness your whole life, it's difficult and painful to be thrust out into the light, but eventually he's able to look up and see the sun itself. This is all symbolism, it's all a metaphor. So he's able to look at the sun. And so he has escaped his darkness and now sees the light. Now, this simple little allegory is a symbolic story, like all allegories are. It's simple on the surface, but it's meant to be understood as a symbol of a higher kind of a truth. Your job is to grasp it and then elevate each stage up a higher dimension. Okay? So let's talk about what this is. The prisoners. Who do these prisoners really represent? They represent everybody. The entire human race is born into this condition. So we begin chained and ignorant, only seeing the passing shadows. And this really is how it is. When you're born as your little baby, you're looking around, and even as you're growing up, all you know is the world around you. And you adjust yourself and you consider the world you live in normal. Growing up in America, you have a really good kind of normal that you get to acclimate yourself to. In other messed up parts of the world, all the terror and violence that goes on, that's their normal. All we really know is what's presented to us when we're born. And we do our best to make sense of that world. These shadows going by are that reality. And the cave itself ultimately is a symbol of the ignorance in which the human race is born into. Now, behind the scenes are these marionette players, these puppeteers. Who do these puppeteers represent? Give me some examples, I should say, of the people who manipulate reality for their own benefit, to keep you enthralled with something instead of really thinking. Who are the people that have a vested interest in doing that? Politicians. Okay, government. Advertising, marketers. Politicians just want you to feel good and vote for their candidate, not think about all the crappy things they've done. Marketers want you to buy things that you don't really need, but they want to create desire for them in you. Who else?
Friends and family.
Could be your friends and family. I should say so-called friends, and maybe not your best family members. Your mom and dad ought to teach you to think for yourself and to be genuine, but not everybody has those parents. The media. You know, most cable news shows have some ideological slant one way or the other. They're not just telling you the facts. All that we report, you decide. You know that's nonsense, right? They're giving it to you in a particular perspective. All right. Any others you can think of?
Some religions.
Religion? So these are all the various forces, the various kinds of people that have an interest in manipulating what you value, what you see as reality, for their own gain. These people are a little bit ahead of the masses in their understanding of it, but they too are still in the cave of ignorance, thinking that whatever wealth or power they're acquiring through the manipulations is their goal in life. They're still in the cave. Now, this steep and rough ascent out of the cave, what does that represent? The struggle for higher knowledge, the struggle to actually learn to think for yourself. It's not an escalator ride. It's not an easy stroll. It's difficult. It is painful to have to accept that you've held opinions for years, perhaps, that you suddenly realize are wrong. And to have the courage to change your mind, to question yourself, is a difficult thing. And that's why it's a steep and rough ascent described out of the cave. Politicians, of course, try to manipulate that. Anybody that changes their mind, they call a flip-flopper, as if being consistent is the highest virtue. No, the highest virtue is having the courage to keep thinking and grow in your opinions. As Abraham Lincoln said, I would rather be right than consistent. So real virtue is to struggle to question yourself. Outside of the cave, when we get to the real trees and the real ducks, this represents the realm of the forms. Remember, advance everything up a dimension. So the physical real world in the allegory represents the world of concepts, of the abstract universal forms. And the sun, as we already know, represents the logos. All right. Now, a couple of critical questions here. How did this prisoner free himself? What caused him to break his chains and look for knowledge? Somebody let him go. Somebody came down there and broke his chains. That was the trick question. Because most people are complacent, and they will sit there in their routine lives and accept comfort and security and no stress on the mind, rather than doing the difficult work of questioning things. And so it's very often outside forces that break your chains and force you to do it. Okay, this is what teachers are always trying to do, but it doesn't have to be, going to college or school that does this. All kinds of things in your life can break these chains. What kind of other experiences cause you to, in a very shocked way, rethink your reality? Loss, okay? When suffering happens in your life, and you realize that an easy, kind of simple, pretty view of the world maybe isn't reality. And so suffering can cause it. Traveling. Go travel to a different country. Go spend some time in another culture where what's normal is something very different than what you grew up with as being normal. And you're going to realize that your life hasn't been normal, it's just been the particular life that you were born into. This forces you to think things from the outside in a broader way. So it's a variety of things that might cause this to happen. But ultimately, it's usually an outside force that triggers this. Somebody's got to break it. And hopefully your parents were the first ones to do this. Any parents in the room? You got kids? How old are your kids?
Between 14 and 26.
Okay, so you've had plenty of experience in raising kids. All right, so when they were 3, 4, 5 years old, they liked watching TV and cartoons, right? Mm-hmm. Who doesn't? My 3-year-old does as well. Yeah. All right? Now, when you set your kids in front of the TV, did you surround them with all the great books of the world and wait for them to turn off the TV and open a book and begin the hard process of reading and thinking?
I didn't set my kids in front of the TV.
Well, good for you. But no, at what point are they going to decide, I've had enough TV, let me embrace the difficult task of reading? They never do this. So when do your kids start doing these difficult things? When you make them do it. Exactly. You turn off the TV, you set them in front of a book, you give them difficult things to do. And they're going to whine and complain and not like this at all. Now, you might have to force them to read a book when they're 7 years old. Maybe even when they're 9 and 10 years old. But your kid that's in the 20s, do you still go over to their apartment, knocking on their door and say, hey, you need to read a book? No, because somewhere along the line, they decided that they kind of liked reading a book. They decided that even though it's difficult at first, the pain of getting there is worth it for the rewards. I certainly hope when I'm an ancient old professor, I'm not going to go to my daughter's house when she's 40 years old and turn off her TV and make her read a book. I'm hoping by then she's going to love learning, long before then. So this is what it's like to break out of this complacency and start thinking. It's often outside forces or experiences that jar you into it, and it might not be pleasant at first. And that process is a difficult, steep climb out of there. After this prisoner has become an enlightened philosopher, he begins to remember his friends back there in the cave. He feels bad for them. Here they are just watching reality television. The irony of that term should be apparent to you. As if this matters. And so, feeling bad for them, he chooses to go back down into the cave to try to break their chains and help them out of their ignorance. And he tells them, guys, there's so much more to the world than these shadows going by. There's a higher reality. There's people manipulating, but there's a better world beyond that. You just got to struggle for it. Come on. Are his former friends going to be grateful to him for bringing him this wisdom? How are they going to react to him? You crazy. You don't know what you're doing. You went out and you blinded yourself in the world. Okay, you so smart now. I'll tell you what shadow's coming up next? We just had 3 grunts. What's coming up next? Can our philosopher even remember this silly game? Does he care? No. He's trying to say, who gives a crap about this? There's such a better world. See, you knew nothing. You all went to college and you just ruined your head. You got your master's degree, right? What are you, my master's something now? I'm telling you, you're here changing your life. You're becoming different people in college. What do you go to your 10-year high school reunion? And you see the people that were your buddies in high school, but who didn't do anything with their lives. They're still just going to be working at Walmart or Taco Bell. They wouldn't have gone to school. They wouldn't have changed. They will have not changed at all in 10 years. You will have changed. And you're going to find that these people are alien to you now. You just can't hang out and bro out with them like you could in high school. It's a little sad, but that's how it goes. And that's what's required if you want to not be a slave, if you want to actually understand. So maybe 1 or 2 chains he's able to break. It's always the hope that you can come back in and help somebody else see the light. But ultimately, everybody's got to make that decision finally on their own. They've got to climb out by themselves. You can't carry them out of the cave. They got to make that climb on their own. Okay, so that's the nature of the allegory and what all the various things mean. Plato put this in one of his many dialogues, and remember that his dialogues were not philosophical lectures for a bunch of graduate students. They were popular reading. They were designed to be read by ordinary citizens so that regular people could become philosophers and meaningful contributors to their society. So that's why it's written in this simple and popular way. So how are you supposed to make use of this. Let's put an example on this to try to see how somebody might go from the cave of ignorance to enlightenment. Okay, I'm just going to make up a hypothetical example. Let's pick a slave prisoner right here. Let's make her Susie, a 14-year-old girl, just going to high school. Say hi to Susie.
Hi, Susie.
Okay. Susie comes home from school one day and is watching TV, and one of those Victoria's Secrets commercials comes on. You know those commercials, right? Where the models are dressed with angel wings. They're walking on the walkway, and they're all beautiful, gorgeous, gorgeous models, right? Little Susie sees these models and is like, oh my God, they're beautiful. I want to be beautiful like them. And then she looks down at her still prepubescent, potato-shaped body. Thinks, God, I don't look like them. I don't like that at all. But I want to. I'm going to work for it. So Susie begins to diet and exercise. Maybe that's a good thing. But she still doesn't seem as thin and lean as those models. And so as she continues doing it, she's eating less and less and less. And then she's only eating once a day. And then hardly anything at all a day. She's losing weight too rapidly. Her mom notices her getting rather unhealthy looking. And she forces Susie to sit down and eat some, meat and potatoes and get some vegetables in her. But Susie's learned another trick. Okay, I might have to eat while mom's looking at me, but then what do I do when I go to the bathroom? Exactly. So little Susie becomes 16, 17 years old. She weighs 82 pounds. You can count her ribs. And after a couple of years of constant eating and purging and vomiting, what do her teeth look like?
No clue.
They're all worn down, little yellowish nubs and stuff. So all of Susie's efforts were about trying to look like that beautiful image that she saw on the TV screen. And a couple of years of pursuing that image, she's laying there looking like an anorexic. What happened? How can the desire to be beautiful have such a reverse effect and make you look like Skeletor at the end of it? What is the mistake that Susie has made according to Plato's Allegory?
She turned away from the true form of beauty.
She's pursuing the shadow, not the substance, not the reality. Now there is a little dim glimmer of that reality. Those Victoria's Secret models are in fact beautiful. So there's a dim little shadow of beauty that she glimmered there. But it was something created by this Victoria's Secret marketing executive. Victoria's Secret guy who made these commercials. Now, this guy that made these commercials that turned her into looking like Skeletor, was he thinking in his mind evil thoughts? Was he possessed by demons? Ha 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 ha! I will make teenage girls look like Skeletor! Is he trying to do this? No. What's on his mind? What's his motivation? Money. He's just thinking about money. I got to get people to buy Victoria's Secret products. I got to get people to want to look like this so that they'll make more money in our company. So it's not that he was possessed by evil. Evil forces didn't take him over. He was just more concerned with making money and the things of this world than of higher truths. And since Susie doesn't know any better, we're all born ignorant and just know what we see, she is duped by it. Now somebody needs to come down there and break her chains. And who might that be? Hopefully her parents are going to step in at this point, or a good friend. And what can mom maybe show Susie that'll break that chain? That'll show her the illusory nature of this beauty she's pursuing. You could show different forms of beauty, but she is so obsessed with the idea that being super skinny and looking like a model is what's beautiful. What does she need to learn about those supermodels? How do they distort it? They Photoshop it. Have you ever seen a supermodel photographed without her makeup on? Like caught in some tabloid magazine or something? Even supermodels don't look like supermodels. All of that is Photoshop, hours and hours in the makeup chair, constant manipulation. You got to trim off all the little cauliflower on the back and narrow down the sides and everything. They don't even look like this. In fact, if you did look like that, you would be a genetic freak. To have a waist that narrow and big boobs and all that, I mean, you'd be a mutant if you actually looked like that. But we present very artificial images to people, and we begin to accept them as this impossible ideal of beauty. So maybe if Mom shows Susie one of those videos you can easily find on YouTube of basically a 3-minute video that condenses 5 hours in the modeling chair and then another couple of hours of photoshopping on the images there, you'll realize that you're looking at something completely artificial. And while it is a dim reflection of elements that we find beautiful, it is not the thing itself. So maybe this will break her chains and shock her to look at something a bit higher. She needs to find the real form of beauty, the true abstract concept of beauty. Would we all agree that among the other characteristics you might assign to a beautiful person, that a healthy body is necessary to be beautiful? Okay, a sickly, pale, that's just not pretty, is it? Okay. And that's what she's become. If you can get her to see herself honestly in the mirror, she'll realize that she is pale and sickly, and that's simply not attractive. And if you want to be beautiful, step one is to be healthy. And so let's hope Susie learns some better eating habits. Let's hope she learns to exercise in moderation, eat proper meals, and then slowly, hopefully, she'll get over these distortions of her youth, climb out of this cave, and realize that beauty is about finding your own inner beauty, being healthy, being confident. And these things have a lot more to do with what makes a beautiful person than trying to match some artificial image down there in the cave or on the TV screen. So it's just a made-up example, but this is the way that Plato wanted you to use this. To think about all the opinions you have, all the things you desire, what you think is real and important in the world, and ask yourself, where did this opinion come from? Are these really my opinions? Or has somebody presented these to me and I've just kind of absorbed them? I'll give you an actual one from my own life. I grew up here in the South. I'm an Orlando native. I grew up in Pine Hills, Florida. And growing up in Pine Hills back in that day, it was kind of a redneck good old boy sort of a neighborhood. And growing up in the South, there's this weird legacy of a conflict of the mid-19th century called the Civil War. Now, the South lost the Civil War, although you might never know that from how we talk about it in the South. We call it the War of Northern Aggression. I grew up in a world where damn Yankee was one word. And I remember the other older boys in the neighborhood, that were old enough to drive now, they'd have pickup trucks with a rebel flag hanging in the back window. In the 70s, we used to watch the Dukes of Hazzard. And the car that Bo and Luke drove, the General Lee, had a Confederate flag on the roof, right? So this is all just, good time, good old boy stuff. It's something that bonded us as a community. And I wanted to feel part of my society. Remember, I used to have a belt buckle that I had when I was a kid. I was like 10 years old. And it had a flag of the Confederacy on it and the motto, "The South will rise again." We used to say stuff like that, "The South will rise again." Then somewhere in junior high school, 8th grade, I think, in history class, we learned about the Civil War, where all this imagery and stuff came from. And I learned something shocking. Did you know that the Civil War was about slavery? I didn't really know this beforehand. I just thought that the Northerners were a bunch of carpetbaggers that came down here to oppress our way of life, and we fought back valiantly, and man, one day we're going to rise again. Wait, we used to have slaves? We did what to people from Africa? Are you kidding me? That's horrible. And as I learned the reality of slavery, the made-for-TV movie Roots was on about this time in my youth, and so I got a very graphic depiction of the horrors of slavery. I was suddenly disgusted by all of this. And it was painful to realize this. Something that I valued and cherished in my upbringing suddenly now looks completely different. And it's a painful climb out of that cave But I eventually looked at that belt buckle of mine and realized, to my utter astonishment, I don't want the South to rise again. It was actually a good thing that the South lost the Civil War. We'd have continued with slavery for who knows how much longer. Our country would have been split into two countries that would have been fighting with each other all through our history. And without being a United States of America, who would have defeated the Nazis in World War II? If Abraham Lincoln hadn't done what he'd done, as harsh and drastic as it was, to keep the Union together, all of global history would have been different, and probably for the worse. I can't believe I was wearing a symbol that was linked to the desire to maintain the institution of slavery. And what I realized was that I'd been looking at this distorted vision of patriotism. I felt a patriotic pride in being a Southern boy, a Southern gentleman. In fact, according to my grandmother, I am descended from the family of Robert E. Lee himself. He's my great-great-great-great-great-great-great uncle, apparently. Like Southern royalty. I was always very proud of that association. But the South is on the wrong side of history. And I've allied myself to that because I'd only seen this distorted view of patriotism, this desire to belong. I love my country, but we know what I love about America? Same thing you love about America. Freedom. You're free to do what you want in this country. You're not told by some tyrannical dictator what you got to do with your life. I love the idea of freedom. Where was freedom for the slaves before the Civil War? That's a complete violation of the core principle that makes me feel patriotic. And so my understanding of the form of patriotism, the concept of patriotism, and realizing that it's a central link to the form of freedom, finally, in pondering this, I adjusted my opinions. I changed my mind. I flip-flopped on my feeling about the Confederacy. I still consider myself a Southern gentleman. There's interesting, valuable parts of that heritage, perhaps. But certain symbols, maybe it's time to retire. So, personal example. We have one more way of looking at this. From all of the later philosophers who continued writing about Plato, and by dredging all of his dialogues, we're able to reconstruct something that is lost to us. And that is Plato's actual lecture notes to his philosophy students. What we have surviving are the popular writings that he made. But if he'd been a student in his class, he might have presented all of this a little bit differently, along the lines of something that we call the divided line. The divided line is really just another way of looking at the same kind of thing. The divided line is not this line here that divides it this way. The divided line is the thick line across the middle here in your little handout and diagram that I had you print out. And this is a way of charting our understanding of things as we go up different levels. From the level of images, the level of things, the level of concepts, and then finally perhaps wisdom itself. This side, the left side of the divided line, refers to the objects that we're responding to. On the right side refers to the kind of mental activity that is happening in conjunction with it. At the level of images, we are merely imagining. At the level of things, we merely hold beliefs of others. When we get to the realm of concepts, then we begin genuine thinking. And at the highest level, we perhaps attain the wisdom as we meditate upon the Logos. That top level is a little bit murky. It's hard to know when you're really there. But the other three levels are the things that we can think about pretty clearly. So let's look at this. You've already had a handout on it that you've read, but let's look at this through a concrete example. Think back to when you were little kids, 4 or 5 years old. And think about how you slowly came to know what a car was. Let's pick some simple example like an automobile. What were your earliest artificial images of cars you encountered as a child watching cartoons? They have wheels. Okay, cars have wheels, right? So you saw like Hot Wheels. You had toy cars that you saw in commercials. Transformers, okay, those are cool cars, right? The Flintstones mobile. You're dating yourself there, Ruth, with the Flintstone mobile. Okay. I also grew up watching the Flintstones. Remember Speed Buggy anymore? Before your time. All right. What about the Mach 5? Speed Racer? Okay, so they got revived in modern times. And as a kid, I grew up loving superheroes, so my favorite car was the Batmobile. Now, the Batmobile is not a real car.
Say so.
And at the level of a child looking at the Batmobile, what do I know about cars based on the Batmobile? What does the Batmobile do?
Goes fast.
It goes fast.
Really fast.
Got a nuclear engine. Got all kinds of crime-busting gear that pops out of it. It is a zoom crime-fighting mobile. All right. Now, while this is a very artificial image, there are certain elements that do correspond to actual cars, right? Like what?
It has wheels.
It's got 4 wheels. It's got a chassis, got some seats, a steering wheel. I do have the dimmest of notions of what a car is as I look at the Batmobile. All right, now, advance a few years. I'm 7 or 8 years old, and I'm going with my mom to the grocery store. As I'm driving along, I'm looking around at mom's car, and of course, when you're at that age, what's your favorite kind of car? Whatever mom and dad drives, right? The family car is your favorite kind of car. So, I'm looking at mom's car. And you start to notice that there's different kinds of cars on the road. And that the ones that are the same make and model as the family car, you notice those more. You ever notice when you buy a new car? You start noticing that kind of car on the road? All right, so your mind's being triggered and you're thinking a little more, you're engaged in it, but still your opinions about what's the best kind of car are not really your opinions. They're simply beliefs that you've absorbed without thinking about it. If your mom had a different kind of car, something different would be your favorite car. Now, some of you will know what I'm talking about here, because in America, there's 2 kinds of families when it comes to cars. 2 kinds of dads you might have had. What are these 2 kinds? There's Chevy dads, and there's Ford dads, right? You got Chevy people, you got Ford people. All right. I grew up, my stepfather was a Chevy guy, so he always had Chevys growing up. And when I turned 16 and they bought me my first little, rundown beater to start working on cars, the first one I got was a 71 Plymouth Valiant. Awesome car. Broke down all the time, but I learned how to work on cars. Got me to high school and got me through my time in Valencia. Big comfy bench seats on it. Yeah, I don't make cars like that anymore. And then when I graduated Valencia and I was about to start having to drive across town to UCF, the old Valiant just wasn't going to make it anymore. It's time for me to go actually buy my own car. I didn't choose this Plymouth Valiant. My stepdad went through the auto trader, found this car, and I just saw it in the driveway one day. It cost $600. Now that it's time for a new car, George is bigger now, so it's time for him to buy his own car. Guess what kind of car he bought? A Chevy, right? Now, I didn't really choose this Chevy. Again, my stepfather went through the auto trader, found a good example, a good car, took me there, and I paid for it. I did the work and I maintained it and all, but still, he's the one that guided me to it. And I got my next car, the first one I paid for myself, was a 78 Chevy Monte Carlo. And I knew it was in the stars that I was meant to have this car. You know why? Because I bought this car from a guy named Carlos who lived on Carl Street. And from him I bought my Monte Carlo. That's in the stars right there. Even more comfy bench seats. Got some nice dates in that back seat of that car. Got me to the beach, got me through UCF. Still a nice car. Now, the time I finish UCF, it's time for me to go to graduate school. Of course, I'm going to FSU. Don't know. And that's about a 4-hour drive from Orlando. My 78 Monte Carlo really ain't gonna make that anymore. It's time for me to get another vehicle, get a new vehicle. I'm making good money cleaning carpets and stuff. so I can afford to get a decent vehicle. And I make this decision. I decide, you know what? I'm gonna get a pickup truck. Because I'm going to be moving a lot. I'll be in graduate school. I'll constantly have to move my furniture. This way I don't have to rent trucks. I can move my own stuff. I can always, make extra money, hauling stuff off for people. I think it'd be a good investment for me to get a pickup truck. Now, we've never been a pickup truck kind of family. Stepdad was, hot rod Chevy kind of guy. So I didn't really have any information to fall back on other than these vague beliefs that I'd had. So I start looking at, of course, Chevy trucks. Now, in the late 80s, as I'm shopping for this Chevy truck, the Chevy S10, if you know anything about trucks, is crap. Terrible reviews, breakdowns, awful. And so now I'm in this dilemma. I know I need to get a truck. I have this inherited belief that Chevys are the way to go. Chevys rule, Fords drool, man. But now I realize that a Chevy truck is not going to be a good investment for me. And so now the painful experience of my chains breaking and climbing this steep and rough ascent, going above the divided line to thinking about ideas, to actually thinking about it in the first place. Now guess what kind of truck I ended up getting? No, I would be disowned by my family. No, I didn't get a Ford. They're too expensive anyway. Great trucks, but way too pricey. No, I actually had to do even more creative thinking than this dichotomy of Chevy versus Ford that I had grown up in. I had to go outside of all that. So I did my research. I read a lot of Auto Trader, Auto Truck magazines. I looked at the reviews. I looked at the value. I began to think about concepts. Value, reliability. And I ended up buying, can you guess? No. Close. I bought a Toyota. I bought an 88 Toyota pickup truck. A truck that I drove for 13 years. I might still be driving it. Some idiot Valencia student crashed into it, so I had to go. This truck, man, is built, it's a monster. The air conditioning broke down 3 or 4 times in the time that I owned it, but I had that replacement down to 2 hours flat by the time I was at the end of this. AC system was a little bit weak, but other than that, this thing is reliable, hardly ever broke down, hardly ever had a problem. This was the right decision for me to make. And I was only able to make it because I learned to actually start thinking for myself. So I came to my opinion. I went through the mouth of the cave, I went across that dividing line. At the upper level, who knows? I drive an awesome Jeep these days. I can afford to drive what I want. That upper level is hard to say when you get there. Who knows when you achieve wisdom? But one way of looking at it, perhaps, is that maybe if I'd gone on to become an auto engineer, and I understood, much more deeply, than I do the nature of the physics involved in automobiles. How basically you're replicating the actions of stars and energy releases in a contained environment to create propulsion. That kind of intimate level of knowledge. Maybe that would take me there. Or if we look at it culturally, what does a car mean in our culture? America's a car culture, much more than most other cultures. When you got your first car, what did that mean to you?
It's freedom.
Freedom. That's American, isn't it? It means freedom. Once I had a car, I didn't have a curfew anymore. Responsibility. Car is a status symbol. It's a source of fun and pleasure as well as your reliable means to get to work and to school. So cars mean a lot of things. In any case, just a couple of simple examples of how this Platonic thinking is meant to be applied to our lives. You can't just sit complacently in the cave of ignorance, watching television and buying the products that they present to you. You've got to force yourself to think. And this thinking is not easy. It is painful to force yourself to realize that you've held opinions that you absorbed without ever really thinking about them. And it takes a special kind of courage to admit that to yourself and to let yourself grow and change during your life. So as this brings us to the end of our discussion of early Greek philosophy, I want you to notice something that's been happening as we've gone along. We began with the nature philosophers, separating the world into becoming and the realm of being. And this separation is the same separation between the physical world and the realm of the forms. It's the same separation as the divided line. These are all just various ways and elaborations of thinking about the same thing. And in the allegory of the cave, where is that line that separates? Mouth of the cave, very good. This is all the same line all the way across. What Greek philosophy essentially developed and bequeathed to Western civilization is the idea that the physical world around us is simply not all that there is for us to be concerned with. That there is more to life than what our senses tell us. That spending a life merely trying to acquire physical things, wealth and power and status, is in many ways a wasted life. The true life is the life of the mind, or for them it would be the life of the soul, because that's where rational thinking came from in their view. The true life is one that goes beyond the transient world of physical appearances and looks for universal, eternal truths, and then tries to shape this world and accord our own lives in line with those higher truths. And therein lies the possibility and the hope of maybe making life better. And if you look across Western history, life has gotten better. We used to have slavery, and now we've abolished it. Women used to be disenfranchised, not allowed to vote. Now you have the right to vote. On all kinds of fronts, we have made life better by our own efforts. And we've done it essentially by thinking about ideas, virtues, values, concepts, and pursuing those things courageously. And the result is the world we get to live in now. So, thank you, Plato, and all these other philosophers for starting us on this long path to the wonderful world of the future that we now live in. 25 centuries ago, this all began. After 25 centuries of this ongoing conversation, we managed to reshape the world and make it a little more perfect.